Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's hearing on deteriorating religious freedom conditions in Nicaragua. Thank you to our distinguished witnesses for taking the time to join us today. My name is Steve Schneck, and I am currently serving as the chair of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USCIRF. USCIRF is an independent, bipartisan U.S. government advisory body that was created by the 1998 International Religious Freedom Act, or IRFA. The Commission uses international standards to monitor freedom of religion or belief abroad and makes policy recommendations to the U.S. government. Today, USCIRF exercises its statutory authority under IRFA to convene this hearing. Since 2018, the Nicaraguan government, led by President Daniel Ortega and his wife, Vice President Rosario Murillo, has engaged in increasingly repressive actions against religious communities. In 2018, the government violently cracked down on demonstrators protesting proposed Social Security reforms. The Catholic Church provided sanctuary for the demonstrators, and some clergy spoke out against the government's human rights violations. Since then, the Nicaraguan government has intensely persecuted the Catholic Church. Clergy and lay people are arbitrarily arrested, imprisoned, and exiled for engaging in peaceful religious activity. Many have experienced medical neglect and torture while in custody. The Nicaraguan government has also arbitrarily canceled the legal status of and seized property from Catholic charitable and educational organizations. These include the Jesuit-run University of Central America and many others. Moreover, uniformed and plainclothes government agents conspicuously monitor Catholic churches, schools, and ceremonies. They often order worshipers not to participate in peaceful religious activities. The Nicaraguan government's full-scale crackdown on religious freedom has extended beyond the Catholic Church to other faith communities. In December of 2023, authorities arrested 11 pastors affiliated with the Evangelical Mountain Gateway Ministry on spurious money laundering charges. In March of this year, all 11 were sentenced to either 12 or 15 years imprisonment, and each was fined $80 million. In addition, religious leaders and parishioners in Indigenous communities, including members of the Moravian Church, face harassment, intimidation, and intimidation for peacefully practicing their faith. The Nicaraguan government draws on its shockingly repressive legal framework to attempt to give this persecution a veil of credibility. The authorities have used legislation such as Law number 1042 on cybercrimes and Law number 977 on money laundering to wrongfully imprison religious leaders and parishioners. The Ortega-Murillo regime has also used burdensome registration laws and reporting requirements for nonprofit organizations to justify its shuttering of religious organizations or to compel them to close, including the Order of Jesuits. I will now turn the floor over to my colleague, Commissioner Maureen Ferguson, to discuss some of USCIRF's policy recommendations related to Nicaragua. Commissioner Ferguson.
Thank you. And I would like to join you in welcoming everyone to today's hearing. And thank you in particular to our witnesses for taking the time to join us. Thank you for offering your expertise, but mostly for your courage and your heartfelt testimony. I was reading through your testimonies last night and found them to be very moving. So we look forward to hearing from you. I would like to give a brief overview of USCIRF's policy recommendations to the U.S. government. And again, we look forward to hearing from our witnesses about their policy recommendations. In USCIRF's 2024 annual report, we recommended that the U.S. Department of State redesignate Nicaragua as a country of particular concern, or CPC, under the International Religious Freedom Act. This designation is reserved for the worst religious freedom violators. In December of 2023, we were pleased that the State Department did in fact redesignate Nicaragua a CPC, and we encourage it to do so again this year. USCIRF has recommended that the U.S. government support the United Nations group of human rights experts on Nicaragua. These experts are carefully documenting religious freedom violations occurring in the country. And in March of 2023, the group of experts released a 300-page report, and it found reasonable grounds to believe that the Nicaraguan government had committed crimes against humanity, against its civilian population, including against members of religious communities. This documentation provides essential evidence that future prosecutors may use in trials against Nicaraguan government officials responsible for particularly severe religious freedom violations. USCIRF also recommends that the U.S. government support bipartisan legislation, such as the Restoring Sovereignty and Human Rights in Nicaragua Act of 2024. This legislation would expand the legal grounds for sanctions against religious freedom violators in Nicaragua. It would be one step towards greater accountability and would signal that the U.S. government continues to be deeply concerned with religious freedom conditions in the country. We look forward to discussing further policy options the U.S. government may consider during this hearing. Lastly, I would like to highlight that USCIRF welcomes the U.S. government's support for the Organization of American States' June resolution on the Nicaraguan government's continued religious freedom and human rights violations. The OAS General Assembly, its permanent council, and its autonomous human rights body, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, have continuously called out the Nicaraguan government's ruthless persecution. We encourage the U.S. government to continue engaging with the OAS and its regional partners to highlight the Ortega-Murillo regime's violations. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses, and with that, I'll turn the floor over to you, Chair Snick.
Thank you, Commissioner Ferguson. I'd also like to take a moment to recognize two other USCIRF commissioners who are with us today. First, Dr. Asif Mahmood is with us, and then second, I want to recognize our newest commissioner, Rabbi Meir Soloveichik. Welcome to both of these commissioners. I would now like to briefly introduce our witnesses. First, we will hear from Christopher Hernandez-Roy. Mr. Hernandez-Roy is the Deputy Director and Senior Fellow of the American Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Then we will hear from Felix Maradiaga. Mr. Maradiaga is a trustee at Freedom House and an exiled Nicaraguan human rights activist. The next witness will be John Britton Hancock. Mr. Hancock is the founder of Mountain Gateway Ministry. Our final witness will be Anexa Alfred. Ms. Alfred is a member of the United Nations Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and an exiled Indigenous Nicaraguan human rights defender. Thank you all for being here. Mr. Hernandez-Roy, please begin your testimony.
Good morning, everybody. Chairman Schneck, Commissioner Ferguson, Commissioner Soloveichik, and Commissioner Mahmood, thank you very much for inviting me to participate today in this important hearing. It's an honor to be here, and I commend USCIRF for focusing on this urgent, important, and evolving challenge to religious freedom in Nicaragua. My comments today are my own and should not be attributed to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And rather than detailing the various abuses of the Ortega-Murillo dictatorship with respect to religious freedom, which I think others here today, other witnesses here today, can probably do better than I will focus more on the motivation of the regime and offer some suggestions for the U.S. government. The deteriorating conditions for religious freedom in Nicaragua are having a profound effect on Nicaraguan society, and the persecution of members of the clergy of different faiths, along with severe limits on the ability of the faithful to worship, are only getting worse as the regime descends into totalitarianism, and I don't use that word lightly. In their pursuit of absolute control, the dictatorship has made every effort to close all civic space in Nicaragua. They do this through the persecution and criminalization of any persons or organizations identified or perceived as opponents of the government, the prohibition of protests and social demonstrations, the dismantling of social movements in the media, the massive closure of organizations, banishment, the stripping of citizenship, confiscation of property, and of course, through the persecution of religious leaders and limiting the opportunities for the faithful to exercise their religion. Religious organizations provide a key scaffolding in Nicaragua. Religious institutions and their leaders are deeply entrenched within the communities they serve, a feature which makes them a threat to the Ortega-Murillo regime's authoritarian political project. Yet this is not new. President Ortega has deep and long-held grievances against the Catholic Church in particular, which he sees as a political actor that opposed his regime in the 80s, contributed to his electoral defeat in 1990, and now opposes his crackdown since the 2018 protests. He is intent on dismantling the Catholic Church and other religious organizations through a relentless and intense cycle of harassment and persecution as part of his plan to consolidate a dynastic dictatorship, the very thing he fought against as a young Sandinista rebel seeking to topple the Somoza dictatorship. The Ortega-Murillo regime's religious persecution has not just targeted Nicaragua's Catholic Church. Pastors from the Evangelical Christian Church have been arrested and exiled, and evangelical organizations closed. The Indigenous Moravian Church has also been harassed, attacked. Religious persecution in Nicaragua is intimately bound up in the regime's broader strategy of survival and efforts to strangle civil society within the country. To strike back, the United States and like-minded countries need a comprehensive theory of change, which effectively targets the tools the regime uses to repress its people. While the US government recently announced sanctions on more than 250 Nicaraguan officials and supporters of the regime, as well as against the regime's sources of revenue from gold mining, a more muscular sanction strategy towards Nicaragua is needed, one which targets the instruments and agents of repression. The Nicaraguan Army's pension fund, for example, is one thing that should be brought under a microscope and banned from investing in and drawing profits from US capital markets. Nicaragua's economy is overwhelmingly dependent on access to the US market. While suspending Nicaragua from CAFTA-DR regional freight trade agreement may not be possible, the US should gradually take additional sector-by-sector trade privileges away or ban the importation of certain Nicaraguan products. However, the potential for second-order consequences like upward migration should be carefully evaluated beforehand. Ortega has come to depend more and more on relationships with fellow authoritarian governments like Russia, China, Iran, and Venezuela. China, for instance, has pledged hundreds of millions in loans to support infrastructure development in Nicaragua, as other sources of international financing for the regime have dried up. The United States should task the Office of Foreign Assets Control to investigate potential PRC firms, which could be subject to sanctions, similar to what the government did recently in sanctioning the training center of the Russian Ministry of Internal Affairs in Managua. Nicaragua has been frozen out of lending from some multilateral banks like the Inter-American Development Bank, yet it still gets loans from the Central American Bank for Economic Integration. While the United States does not hold shares in the bank, it should work with like-minded governments which are members to put pressure on the bank to curtail any lending to Nicaragua until conditions in the country improve. The regime's strategy of imprisoning and subsequently expelling political dissidents is aimed at silencing any criticism of the regime within Nicaragua itself. However, given the sheer number of people that have gone into exile or been forcibly expelled, the US should work with these individuals to amplify their voices, and especially with the Vatican to identify religious leaders who can speak to their experiences defending religious freedom in Nicaragua. The United States should also encourage the gathering of testimony from exiled individuals to help build the basis for a potential international criminal case under the principle of universal jurisdiction against the regime, especially, as has already been mentioned, after the UN's group of human rights experts on Nicaragua said that human rights violations in the country likely amounted to crimes against humanity. Finally, the State Department should work with other like-minded members of the Organization of American States and consider establishing a dedicated rapporteurship on religious freedom within the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. This could be modeled on the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief, but with a mandate specifically on the Americas, leveraging the Inter-American Commission's deep knowledge of the human rights situation in the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hernandez-Roy. Next, we turn to Felix Maradiaga. Mr. Maradiaga.
Thank you so much for inviting me to testify at this significant hearing and for increasing awareness of the situation regarding religious freedom in Nicaragua. To adhere to the time allotted to me, I will present a summarized version of my testimony later. A more detailed version will be submitted for the record. Since its inception decades ago, the Sandinista Front has viewed the Catholic Church as an inconvenient organization, subjecting it to various attacks. In the 1980s, influenced by liberation theology, Sandinismo focused extensively on challenging the formal authority of the Catholic Church, launching discrediting campaigns and various forms of repression. I reference this historical context only to establish a fundamental fact. The Sandinista Front has never fully respected the religious freedom of Nicaraguans. With Daniel Ortega returned to power in 2007, and particularly after the 2018 protests, religious repression has exponentially increased to unprecedented levels in Latin America. However, unlike other totalitarian regimes, such as China and Cuba, the mode of religious repression by Sandinismo is unique. The attacks against the church are not based on an explicit attempt to promote atheism, but rather on an obsessive attempt to subjugate and manipulate the faith of Nicaraguans. The Hippocratically religious rhetoric of Rosario Murillo and Daniel Ortega has been systematic attempts to co-opt the Catholic Church. They have not succeeded, and this failure partly fuels their excessive hatred of the church. The dictatorship of Daniel Ortega and Rosario Murillo deeply represents the special place and regrets the special place the church holds in the hearts of our people. They resent, for example, that the church as an institution, as well as its pastors like Bishop Rolando Alvarez and Silvio Baez, along with hundreds of priests in communion with the church doctrine, have stood by the people and justice during the great violations perpetrated by the dictatorship. This morally correct stance of the church has caused nearly 90 Catholic religious figures imprisoned or forced into exile. These failed attempts to influence or control the church constitute also a violation of religious freedom. Also, following the principle of divide and conquer, the dictatorship has tried to create frictions between Catholics and evangelicals. While the persecution against the Catholic Church is particularly severe, our brothers and sisters of the Moravian and Evangelical churches also face persecution. I am in an interfaith marriage. My wife Berta is Baptist. I am Catholic. We both have members of our respective communities in prison, persecuted, or in exile. Currently, about 30 people are detained due to their ties to the Catholic Church, including Olesia Muñoz, Victor Ticay, and Marta Lorena Centeno, among many others. On June 9th, the dictatorship Ministry of the Interior revoked the legal status of the Catholic radio station Radio Maria and confiscated all its assets. This event marked yet another religious attack on media outlets of the church. To date, the regime has shut down about 420 religious organizations, most of which were dedicated to assisting the most vulnerable population groups through educational, health, and religious activities. Internationally, there have been numerous reports of assaults against religious figures in Nicaragua. And we have accounted of at least 65 members of the Catholic and Protestant Church who has been taken to these trials. Among these, 22 have been stripped of their nationality and condemned to statelessness and crimes against humanity. It is imperative to highlight that at least 84 priests have been expelled from the country, forced into exile, barred from re-entering Nicaragua, and in the worst cases, imprisoned. The denunciation must continue regarding the prohibition of several religious orders and the expulsion of at least 70 nuns dedicated to faith activities in Nicaragua, including the well-known Sisters of Charity, the Sisters of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, and the Carmelite Sisters, as all were unjustly expelled from the country by the Ortega Murillo regime. To date, 22 Catholic and Evangelical media outlets have been shut down, with the majority also being confiscated. We must not mistake the silence imposed by the regime for signs of normalcy. The transnational repression used by the regime, along with the ongoing intimidation of the families of exiled priests, is a stark indicator of the severity of the situation. Anyone who voices opposition to the regime risks having their family in Nicaragua face repression. In conclusion, I urge the Commission to adopt the recommendations of the UN expert group on Nicaragua. I also respectfully urge this Commission to continue working closely with Congress and the executive branch to keep Nicaragua on the list of countries of particular concern. It is also crucial to seriously evaluate the fact that the United States has a free trade agreement with Nicaragua. How can such advantages be granted to a state that violates all basic human rights principles? Additionally, the U.S. must work with its allies to exert more sanctions and pressures, including expanding the list of sanctioned individuals and institutions, such as the Nicaraguan military. The world must stand with Nicaraguan Christians and support them in their struggle. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Maradiaga. Next testimony comes from John Britton Hancock. Mr. Hancock.
Thank you so much for the invitation today. It's a real blessing for us to get to testify before you. Thank you, Chairman Schneck and commissioners, for the opportunity. We really love Nicaragua and the Nicaraguan people. It's a beautiful country, and it's a really sad and serious thing that's happening in Nicaragua right now. I want to thank Ambassador at Large Hussein for calling for the release of our pastors. I want to thank Director Joe Salazar at the State Department and Kevin O'Reilly, who is the U.S. Charge d'Affaires in Nicaragua, for their access, responsiveness, and help to us in our situation. I want to thank multiple members of the United States Congress and having a robust bipartisan response to our situation. Multiple members have written letters and introduced legislation and done floor speeches. The entire Alabama delegation has responded to our situation. Representative Robert Adderholt, Barry Moore, Senators Rick Scott, Ted Cruz, Tommy Tuberville, Katie Britt, Representatives Bruce Westerman, Gary Palmer, Harriet Hageman. They've all taken led actions. They've talked to their constituents. They've done social media posts, and we're so grateful. I'm deeply grateful for ADF International for rallying and helping us on the international scene with the OAS and the UN. So many have helped, and thank you to the IRF office and USCIRF in general also for listing our pastors, giving them profiles and calling attention to our situation. I lead Mountain Gateway, church planning, discipleship, and disaster relief ministry. We were legally registered in Nicaragua as Puerta de la Montaña in 2015, and we've served Nicaraguans ever since. In 2023, with the government's full permission, we led 6,000 evangelical churches to hold 8 mass evangelism events called Buenas Nuevas Nicaragua. About 1 million people attended those 8 events. Our last campaign was in the capital city of Managua on November the 11th. On December the 17th, the Nicaraguan police arrested 11 of our Nicaraguan pastors on bogus money laundering charges. They accused my son, his wife, and myself of the same. In reality, they were arrested for organizing multitudes of people to gather in community and public to worship together for religious purposes only. The pastors have been in a maximum security prison for 7 months. One of the leaders is female and has been illegally separated from her children. One was 2 months old at the time of her arrest. Since their arrest 7 months ago, they've been deprived of contact with any visitors, including family members and their attorney. Our lawyer didn't have any access to court files to prepare a defense. They were tried in March of 2024. No defense evidence was allowed. The defendants were not in the courtroom in person. The prosecution had no direct witnesses. All 11 leaders were convicted and sentenced to 12 and 15 years in prison and fined $80 million per person. We lost our appeal to the Nicaraguan Supreme Court. Mountain Gateway's registration in Nicaragua was canceled without notice, and all of our assets were seized, over $5 million worth. Nicaragua announced via press release that criminal proceedings are outstanding against Jacob Hancock, Cassie Hancock, and myself. Nicaragua utilized Interpol's red diffusion notice to request multiple countries in Latin America to arrest and exile my son, my daughter-in-law, and me to Nicaragua. 6 countries agreed to that we know of: Mexico, Honduras, Cuba, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Brazil. We were never officially notified that there was a problem. They used press releases to state that we were involved in organized crime and money laundering. Sadly, our situation is the latest example of religious persecution by the Ortega Murillo regime. They target anyone they perceived as a threat to their grip upon Nicaragua. In the Buenas Nuevas Nicaragua campaigns, we had virtually every evangelical church in the country working together. Throughout 2023, we had multiple meetings with thousands of pastors and leaders of these churches. I spoke with many leaders who made references to what is common knowledge in Nicaragua. That is every church. That is in every church. There are government informants who monitor and report what they say, what they pray, and what they preach. On occasion, they would lower their voices as they talked to me about this oppression. As long as they only preach the Bible, there's not really a problem. And there seems to be freedom of religion. But when someone speaks biblical truth directly to the government concerning its conduct, that's where the problem is. That and speaking out in solidarity with someone whom the government views as against the Sandinista movement. The consequences for this vary: visible surveillance by police or plainclothes persons, harassment and pressure on their families, arrest, and imprisonment. I've spoken with family members that have had someone they know experience all of these consequences. This is the norm among the entire population of Nicaragua. Everyone knows not to criticize the current regime. This is the norm that is their reality. In our own case, 2 things led to the arrest of our 11 pastors: 2 lawyers and the transnational targeting of my family. 1, the unification of virtually all evangelical churches to work in our Buenas Nuevas campaign. On November the 10th and 11th, combined 325,000 people gathered in the Plaza de Fe in Managua for the last campaign. We had approval for 13 more events in 2024. Nothing quite like this has ever happened in Nicaragua before as a series of meetings. It's been extensively documented in the news, the U.S. government, the OAS, and the UN that since 2018, the current Nicaraguan government has reacted brutally to anything they think could be used to create change in the government of Nicaragua. The Ortega Murillo regime viewed us as a threat, even though we meticulously avoided engaging in any political speech or purpose. They did to us what they did to the Catholics and what they've done to over 3,500 organizations. They reacted abruptly, severely, and unjustly. Mountain Gateway's solitary purpose in Nicaragua was to help the Nicaraguan people, both spiritually and physically, only that. Since arriving in Nicaragua, we focused on rural, marginalized populations, planting churches, and training local leaders. We purchased a fair trade coffee farm, expanding into disaster relief efforts, and we were able to save 4,000 families from natural disasters and conducted mass open-air worship and evangelism events that reached hundreds of thousands of people. We obtained a property, built facilities, and purchased vehicles to carry out our growing ability to help Nicaragua, investing over $10 million into the economy. The government of Nicaragua responded with their paranoid tyranny and brutal disregard for anything beyond their grip on power. We request the IRF office and the USCIRF to highlight these convictions and to renew the demand for the immediate release of the religious leaders of Puerta de la Montaña. To gather for religious purposes in community is protected by the international human right to religious freedom. Nicaragua must be held to its international human rights obligations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hancock. Our final witness today will be Anexa Alfred. Ms. Alfred.
Chairman and members of the Commission, thank you for this opportunity to testify today, particularly on the Indigenous religious community and the Moravian Church. I would like to start by pointing out some data and historical background. The 30% of the Nicaraguans self-identify as Indigenous people or in Afro-descendants, such as the Miskito, the Mayangnas, the Rama, the Ulvas people, and the Afro-descendant Creole and Garifuna, who lives in 304 communities on 23 territories and maintain their own form of cultural, linguistic identity and relationship with their ancestral land, under a regimen of autonomy based on the right to self-determination. The Indigenous people of the Caribbean coast have sustained a historical struggle for the recognition of their right as people that were crystallized in the political constitution of Nicaragua in 1987 after a peace agreement due to the armed conflict with the Sandinista regime in the 80s, which led the massacre of the La Navidad Roja, the bloodiest manifestation of genocide of the Indigenous people in our history. 8,000 displacement and hundreds of Indigenous were massacred, which remains in total impunity. It's important to point out that the Moravian Church played a key role during the time giving support to Indigenous community and its victims. Of that reason, the church was persecuted by the Sandinista regime. Amongst the Indigenous people and Afro-descendants, the predominant religion is the Moravian. This presence of Christian religion displays Indigenous and African religious practices and beliefs. The Moravian Church became autonomous in 1978, passing the administrative to the native pastor, and it's organized in a provincial synod that meets every 3 years, and an executive board presided by a superintendent. I would like to highlight the fundamental role of the Moravian Church in the construction of a society of peace, democracy, and unity of Nicaragua families, especially Indigenous and Afro-descendant families. Now, allow me to refer to the deterioration of the condition of religious freedom. Religious freedom in communities of the Caribbean coast has continued to suffer serious setback with the closure of the civic space since the social political crisis in 2018. This responds to a policy of absolute control promoted by the Sandinista government over the territorial authorities and Indigenous leaders, including religious leaders, which respond to the economic and ruling political party interests over the government's land and natural resources that have resulted in serious violation of human rights that constitute crimes against humanity and has generated deep concern in the international community. The reprisal against the Moravian Church is particularly linked to the systematic violence experienced by the Indigenous and Afro-descendant community. persecution, criminalization, banishment, massacres, and forced displacement due to the invasion of their land and their disposition of their natural resource. The Moravian Church has accompanied the indigenous community by mandate of the Synod since 2016, which demanded that the government take action to protect life and safety on the face of the land invasion. In the context of the social political crisis in the 2018, the Moravian Church participated in the dialogue table along with other actors, which become a target of control for the government, promoting internal division for the Moravian Church with group relating to the ruling political party, emerging to executive body. This generates a deep crisis in the structure of the church, which remain until now and which transcended to the indigenous and Afro-descendant community. The monitoring information of the platform of indigenous and Afro-descendant of Nicaragua, INANA, document attack, intimidation, detention, and disqualification campaign, summarizing this aggression as follow-up restriction of freedom of expression to the prohibition to address issues related to situation of the community and worship and meeting, usurpation of church property, political and legal control over social institutions run by the Moravian Church, aggression, trade, and violence, church, school, clinic, and office, persecution, criminalization, banishment, and forced exiling. In conclusion, Nicaragua is a state that progressively and systematically violates human rights without exception or distinction. Repression, persecution, criminalization, and exile have reached all levels, forcing the 12% of Nicaragua population to the exile. Persecution against indigenous religions community on the Moravian Church has increased alarmingly and silently, particularly indigenous religious leaders who live support to the communities and to the traditional organization. It's urgent that the international community take decision action to put end to the systematic violence against experienced indigenous and Afro-descendant people in all Nicaragua, including the right of religion freedom as a fundamental human right. Finally, I would like to ask to this commission to request a proof of life of the Mosquito leader, Brooklyn Rivera, and Moravian Christian who has been in a state of forced displacement for the past 10 months. Thank you, Pali. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Alfred. And I want to thank all of the witnesses for the powerful and compelling testimony that we've heard today. I wonder if I might take the chairman's privilege and ask a general question here at the start of the questioning. And that question is why? And I'm going to pose this to all of today's witnesses. The Ortega Murillo regime has launched a full-scale attack against religious communities, including those represented here today. It's unrelenting, and it targets charitable and educational organizations, peaceful religious ceremonies, peaceful worshipers. In your view, what is the Nicaraguan government attempting to achieve by cracking down so severely on religious communities? Perhaps Mr. Hernandez-Roy, you might begin.
Certainly, Chairman Schneck, it's a pleasure. So I'm not sure that the crackdown on religious communities is because they are faith organizations. I think it's rather that, given the history that I outlined earlier, and actually that also Jose Felix outlined, it's really that they're collectives, they're groups, they're organized, and in some cases they have been vocal in their dissent, particularly the Catholic Church. And so by the very nature of being organized, it makes them political actors in the eyes of the regime, and therefore potentially dangerous, or actually dangerous from the perspective of Daniel Ortega. You have to keep in mind that this is it's a paranoid dictatorship in the sense that it's completely unrestrained in its desire to stamp out any and all possible form of dissent, and therefore any group that's organized is immediately a target of the regime. Lately, they've even been going after their own, the president's own brother, Humberto Ortega, who was the commander of the Nicaraguan army for decades, and has no love lost for his sister-in-law, excuse me, was recently placed under house arrest a month and a half ago after giving an interview in which he himself described the regime as dictatorial. They've gone under after a former Sandinista guerrilla leader, Rafael Solis Cerda, who served for almost 20 years as the chairman of the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and who had been Daniel Ortega's best man at his wedding. In February last year, along with other people, he was stripped of his citizenship and his assets were confiscated. They're even going after beauty queens. I'm sure you've heard of the case of Janice Palacios, who was a Miss Universe winner in November of last year. And the regime has targeted her for fear her popularity could be used as a source of opposition to the dictatorship. So given this, it's no wonder that the regime has gone after the Catholic Church and now expanded its persecution to other religious organizations.
Mr. Maradiaga, would you like to comment on that question as well?
Yes, I fully concur with the analysis of Mr. Hernandez-Roy. I would like to add that indeed the typology of religious persecution in Nicaragua is unique in the sense that it's not a promotion of atheism, but rather a deliberate intent to manipulate religion. Of course, the Catholic Church, for its structure and its unified character, has been particularly troubling for the regime. The evangelical communities are, of course, more plural and more diverse. They don't have a unified entity for the entire evangelical denomination. So it's apparently easier for the Sandinistas to manipulate some individual pastors. But as we've seen with Puerto de la Montaña, with any a person of faith that adheres to the word of God and preaches justice and in a way threatens the totalitarian nature of the regime, will also be seen as a target. So in my testimony, I would like to highlight, and I extend on this issue on my written testimony, that these are forms of religious persecution as well. It's important to recall that in 2014, the letter of the bishops in Nicaragua actually touch upon this issue, which was the efforts of the Sandinista regime to manipulate the Catholic faith through state institutions. For example, with the program called Hambre Cero, Zero Hunger, which they just distributed food, they invited Catholic and faith-based organizations to distribute these foods, which are, of course, paid through Nicaraguan, taxpayers' money. That in itself wouldn't be problematic. It is understandable with faith-based organizations working on development. The problem is that these type of distributions, and I'm using this only as an example, were tied to political party promotion, to the Sandinista party. And when the Catholic Church stopped and instructed their parishes not to participate in active political promotion of the Sandinistas, of course, the Sandinista party targeted the Catholic Church in particular. One more fact that is important to highlight is that the Nicaraguan state has not been able to cover the number of Nicaraguans that were previously served by the almost 500 religious educational institutions that have been shut down. According to our estimates, about 600,000 Nicaraguans received direct services in education and health. Just to give you an example, in the municipality of Managua, Fabredo Children Foundation served over 5,000 children. And we know as a fact that the state has not been able to cover. So in addition to the attacks that have been highlighted in this hearing, it's important to highlight that many Nicaraguans that were direct beneficiaries of these philanthropic services have been also affected.
Thank you, Mr. Maradiaga.
So I'll jump in with my question because it's right on point with what you were just saying, Mr. Maradiaga, and I think I'll direct the question to you. So Chair Schneck asked why, and I think my question is, what are the consequences? What are the real world consequences of this repression? What happens as a result? So we've heard in your testimony that the Nicaraguan government has shuttered, seized the property of these Catholic charitable and educational organizations. So, for instance, the prominent Jesuit-run University of Central America just closed. So you have, innumerable students, maybe they're halfway towards their degree, their university is just closed. They can't even get a transcript. So that's one example. Another example that really was heartbreaking is, I think it was about 2 years ago, the Missionaries of Charity's property was seized and the nuns were expelled from the country under these bogus charges under the terrorism law. So the Missionaries of Charity, again, founded by Saint Mother Teresa of Calcutta, they did run a home for abandoned and abused adolescents in Grenada. They ran a home for the elderly in Managua, a school for at-risk students, a daycare center for impoverished families. So I guess that's my question. We have these abused teenagers and at-risk students, elderly poor. So what has happened to them as these religious, charitable, and educational institutions have been shut down?
Yes, thank you for the question. I will place the direct impact in 3 different categories. One, it's of course, as you have clearly highlighted, and I thank you for that, is the direct human suffering. So it's the humanitarian impact. Each of these numbers, each of these 600,000 Nicaraguans that were previously served by organizations like Fabretto Children Foundation or by the many other charitable organizations, of course, it's a personal story. I'm a direct testimony of Catholic education, for example. I would have never been able to be the man I am if were not by Colegio San Luis in my native Matagalpa. So the immediate impact is humanitarian. I would say that's category number 1. Category number 2 is a generalized fear. As the UN expert group has highlighted, religious freedom is a sort of portal into other freedoms. So when religious freedom is directly attacked, there is a sense of generalized fear in the entire population, and we see a sort of self-censorship. So people feel that if they cannot express their faith at their parish, at their community, at their service, they cannot exercise any other freedom. And I think that's particularly dangerous. And number 3, which is a direct implication from the United States as a government, is the promotion of mass exile. We are working with our office in Costa Rica on a research on the number of people who are seeking asylum in Costa Rica, how many of them, how many of the almost 250,000 cases by the Costa Rican government are claiming religious persecution. And based on our very general survey, which we have not completed, is close to 15%. So if you think that up until now, close to 1 million Nicaraguans have been forced into exile, at least 150,000 Nicaraguans have at least named in their asylum cases religious persecution as the reason of them fleeing the country.
Commissioner Soloveichik, would you have any questions?
Yes, thank you very much. Mr. Hernandez-Roy made a brief reference to the Vatican. I know Pope Francis made reference in his New Year's address to the situation in Nicaragua. I'm interested in hearing about what actions or statements have been taken by the Vatican, both in a Rome-based way or in an international way, on behalf of all those suffering in Nicaragua right now. And that's perhaps a question for both Mr. Hernandez-Roy and for Mr. Maradiaga. But I'd also be very interested in hearing from all of the witnesses regarding whether, in their respective views, sufficient action has been taken by internationally recognized religious leadership what more can be done, and how can organizations and commissions like USCIRF what can we do to amplify religious voices that are religious leadership that are speaking out.
I'll just jump in first real quick to say that probably Jose Felix can answer this better than I. I have not studied the statements from the Catholic Church, particularly from the Vatican. It's my impression, though, that the Vatican has not been as outspoken as it could be on this subject. Following the churches in Nicaragua, the convening of the national dialogue, and then the reaction by the government against that, and then subsequent expulsion of Bishop Alvarez and others, while the Vatican has spoken out, it just does not seem to me to have, given the significance and the gravity of what's going on in Nicaragua, it doesn't seem to me that a statement now and again is sufficient to shine the spotlight on what's occurring in Nicaragua.
Thank you.
Yes, I will. Thank you for your question. I agree. We would like to hear more of the Pope. However, I will use your question to address a very important perspective, which is why the silence and its transnational repression. I will highlight that as a major reason of why other members of the Catholic Church in exile are not speaking, which is very unusual. And what we've seen is the use of the family members of these religious figures in exile as sort of hostages. It's becoming increasingly difficult even to interview a religious leader in exile because they have extended family. And by family, I mean not only their blood relatives, but their fellow brothers and sisters in faith inside Nicaragua. To give you an example, on a no-name basis of this particular anecdote, I recently visited a Central American country, which I would not name, and the Nicaraguan community in this particular country wanted to hold a religious activity in which I was going to participate. And these particular religious institution asked me not to, and this is outside Nicaragua, not to publicize, not to take pictures, not to do anything in social media about the exercise of my faith outside of Nicaragua, because they were afraid that if the Sandinista regime found out that I was attending a mass in that church outside of Nicaragua, the religious order of them inside Nicaragua was going to be targeted. So it's an extreme case of transnational repression that has forced many priests into silence. It is important for me to emphasize that we shall not interpret this silence as a normalcy, but rather the contrary.
Thank you. Be interested in hearing from the other witnesses regarding religious leadership of other kinds around the world, and whether this has been sufficiently focused upon.
I'll jump in here. Thank you very much. You know, I think the central problem is the effect of freedom relative to oppression and totalitarian philosophy and underpinnings. Freedom is a threat to people who have countries and governments who govern without any accountability, separation of powers, any internal mechanism for placing boundaries on their own actions or thoughts. The reason that we're all talking about this is because there's been a continuing deterioration of the separation of powers and independent branches of government and things like that that can sort of push back on basically basic human selfishness, because a dictator is out of control selfishness with power and ability and resources. And so from the standpoint of the gospel, what we believe in and what we preach is that God created man for a love relationship. Well, love can have no coercion in it. And there has to be freedom for that to exist. That gives rise to freedom of thought, freedom of response, freedom of speech, and all those basic things. And so, is it not religious persecution? I think there's no way to separate it because of freedom's effect on people and the things that naturally arise from people who feel compelled to take action for one reason or the other. And from the standpoint of an evangelical leader, to have handcuffs placed on you and a gag order placed over your mouth, to not be able to apply your convictions based on what you believe the Word of God says about the behavior and actions of people in government is religious oppression. Because if there's no mechanism to stand up and say, we think that's wrong, we think your behavior is wrong, we think your attitudes, because when you empower behavior and attitudes with military or police force, power, and resources, it equals repression. And if selfishness is out of control and you empower that, then that's why I believe that this regime is really kind of turning on its own people right now. They purged the judicial branch of over 900 people. I think that was in December or January of this year. And they were deeply loyal Sandinista people who believe in the ideas. I know many of them. I've had the opportunity to preach to Congress, to pray for and meet with many top officials, not trying to sanction their ideas. I went with the message of Micah 6:8, do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly. Well, if this is not a negative message to give people that have power. If they can be impacted and respond in kind, to do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly, the conditions that they're catalyzing decisions for will get better. If there's no voice that pushes on that, it will get worse. And so it's like Bishop Alvarez, he got in hot water because he stood up and opposed what he saw as blatant human rights violations and the way the government was attempting to respond to the uprising that was happening in 2018. There's a role for that. Evangelical pastors didn't speak up so much directly like that, but they spoke up in different ways. Every one of them that spoke up, they were shut down, and they know they're being watched, they're being listened to. They have to be careful over what they pray. I know that at least one or two of the Catholic priests that just prayed for Bishop Alvarez found themselves in prison, and they were a part of the people that got exiled to the Vatican in January, right? And so they're trying to stop dissent and dissidence. And in order to do that, you have to put boundaries and a lid on the way people express their thinking, because you can't stop people from thinking. No matter what the history and no matter what the background is. And so freedom liberates that and creates, like freedom works. The more freedom there is, the more human thriving is possible. The less freedom there is intact, the less freedom, the less human thriving is possible. That's why religious freedom is important. And that's why the countries that can take more action than they are, I don't know all the mechanisms that are available, because of the issues of national sovereignty and all those things. But I know that we should rally unity for the right ideas, and ideas that espouse freedom and boundaries and separation of powers are the right ideas. And so all of the neighbors, you have all these different complex interworkings of political agreements, and then those create limits on us, and the different philosophies that guide all the different diplomatic engagements. It's extremely difficult nuances that create paradoxes to have to deal with. And so my hat's off to all of you, because I know it's extremely frustrating and difficult. However, some things should be defended. There's a just use of influence and power, and those who have it have to make the judgment call about what to do and how to do it. And the things that can be implemented, like I understand that there are difficulties with Nicaragua's participation in CAFTA-DR, but maybe we need to, whoever's in charge of that and whatever needs to happen, maybe we need to look at those things to put pressure in those ways, not to punish the Nicaraguan people, but to hold those people responsible that are catalyzing all this. The mention of trying to put pressure on banking and things like that. I think there are other tools that, that haven't been employed that maybe we need to look at employing. And if legislation is required, we have two pieces of legislation. They don't take any action, but they do make a statement. But there are other pieces of legislation. Chris Smith's resolution, a bill in the House, and Marco Rubio's bill in the Senate empower more robust sanctioning. We need to get those things passed. This is not a politically dangerous subject. That our situation has gotten robust bipartisan engagement because it's not politically dangerous like some of the other issues going on right now. We need Congress to take action. The State Department, I know from our meetings with people, with the Director for Central American Affairs and the desk officer for Nicaragua, we've had multiple meetings. They want more attention and action to be taken on the part of Nicaragua, because it's a small country, just shy of 7 million people, but it matters.
Mr. Hancock, we have a couple of other questions we'd like to pose. Would
Sure.
you kind of summon, is there some additional remarks that you want to maybe summarize here?
Sir, I mean, what we do here matters, and I'm encouraged by this and the emphasis that we can point there.
Thank you so much. Commissioner Mahmood.
Hi, good morning. First of all, I want to really thank, appreciate, admire for your work, putting your and your families, especially all the witnesses, your and your families' life at risk, your well-being, and your dedication, and most importantly, love for the humanity. We know that things in Nicaragua are not right. About 12% of the population is in exile, and obviously, I would think that 100% of that exile population is because of religious persecution. And this is a common tool which is used all over the world, where there are different religions living. They persecute the other religion, where there's only one religion. Like going to the example of Nicaragua, there's only two denominations of Christians living there, and they are just persecuting, and people are going. I happen to know some Nicaraguans living in Los Angeles and who have gone through horrific times, and they're still going through that. So what I want to bring is more towards, obviously, we want to do everything possible to stop this persecution, stop this oppression and suppression, and make life better for all those who are living in Nicaragua, and those who have left have a better life further where they're living, or they have the easy passage go back to meet their families who they have left. I know people who have 11 or 12 or 13-year-old daughters left behind, or other minors left behind, or some elderly parents left behind, or brother and sister party that somebody actually killed in front of their eyes, especially from 2018 to 2023, the numbers we have, the number of exile or people leaving has skyrocketed. I am going to more concentrate on people who are already in refuge and who have left, whether they're living in the United States or Costa Rica or Mexico or Panama. They are going through a huge turmoil. Number one, leaving their home, leaving their land which they love, leaving their relatives, leaving their families, and now they're coming to a new country with all those kind of economic and tough language barriers and finding the community. And it's just really in a very mind-boggling situation, which really bothers me when I see those people. And I know some other people who are living in exile, but honestly, I believe Nicaraguans, everybody I've come across, are very loving, very nice, very passionate, and good people. What can we do for those people? I know United States has a free trade agreement, and I understand that we don't want to affect that because we don't want to punish 7 million Nicaraguans living over there. And that is the theory behind to not do that. Is there a way that we all can, and maybe I'm stepping a little bit more than my thing, for the rehabilitation, for the well-being of people who are living, certain percentage, maybe 20%, 30% of that taken out of that thing and spent solely on those people who are living in exile, whether they're living in the United States or other countries, and we have an independent body who spend all that money for their children's education, for their housing, for their means to find food. It's not that those Nicaraguans living in hunger and poverty in Nicaragua, people who leave their country, they're also going through this kind of huge challenges. So is there on the thing we can keep the country on country of particular concern, but also what the trade is already going, money is already flowing. If there's a mechanism, either State Department or either we all can come together and find some solution. Okay, this percentage of that money will go to the well-being and rehabilitation of those people until they are free to go back and meet their families, that either they are rehabilitated, that they find the job, that they find the opportunities, so that we can help them. We know people who are living in the United States that they're not in as bad situation, but people who are living in Costa Rica, they are worse situation than when they left home. Only thing is their life might not be in danger, but otherwise living conditions are terrible. Are living in Panama, because all those countries are not rich countries. They don't have the resources to feed and rehabilitate those people, those governments. So we should do something, and I would strongly suggest that we should work on this part. And what is your thought process? Has anybody worked on that? I am not very well versed about those kind of issues in Central America, but I'm really very concerned about those people's well-being and their future, and especially future of their children. Thank you. And this is for everybody, whoever has the answer for them.
I'd like to jump
Can
on
I
that,
take
if
this one?
that's okay. Yes. Oh, sorry. Go, Alexa. Go. You go.
Thank you, Felix. I want to make a reflection about that, because what the Commissioner Mohammed have stated really touched me personally. In my case, I was appointed as an expert at the UN in 2022, and I traveled from my country, from my community, from my family for 5 days to Geneva. And after that, I was denied to enter. And with that, all my life changed. And with that, my kids, my family, my community, because aggression is not only against the person, it's also against the family, the relatives, but also about the community when you're a leader of one community. And it's very difficult. And I stay here in Geneva, where the language is French. I don't have any clue with French, but also I've been studying the situation of the thousand and thousand that indigenous person that been displaced to Honduras, I'm sorry, to Costa Rica, and they're living in situation that worse than in the community. You know, we come from a community what we live with the nature, we have large space, etc., etc. They live in assimilate in Costa Rica. They don't have right, they don't have recognition. The problem of language, and it's very hard. But I'm trying to point out, and based on the experience after I've been banished and find out the situation of my other Nicaraguan around the world, not only in the U.S. And there I would like to make a parenthesis and thank the policies that U.S. has with the situation of Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela, and Haiti, which we don't find that here in Europe. For example, I have documented a situation of people that been persecuted by the regime, and if they return to Nicaragua, they will be disappear. However, Europe, a country here in Europe, is deportating people that here clearly means treat as opposition in Nicaragua, and that's something that very worry us. And thinking about how things can be better in a sense of trying to find out the best thing of all the situation, it's focused on first. It's the legal status of the people that is very important. Second is how to come up with a policy that be really humanitarian, that can allow people to incorporate to this society where we were forced to be. I told you today, I didn't decide to be here. I wanted to be to my community, but the situation put me here, and countries should do something that make this situation become very less hard. And so things that what I find is very important is the legal status, find policy that can help to this community to incorporate to the society where they go, even the US, Costa Rica, whatever. But and the other thing is find some kind of mechanism that can support people in the beginning. I would like to say in the case of Switzerland, where being received me, I had those support. And the other thing, which is very, very important, is the psychological support, because at the end, even we left the country, and people who will decide to the exile, leaving the country is a very, very hard situation. In my case, this banishment, I can compare it like if I did and I starting to live again. So it started to find out my way in a country where I didn't decide to be, but I thank God that I'm finally end up here, because I know that my life is safe, but there's other thing that's coming behind. But I would really like to call to to find and to put all our wills to find and make find policy and practices that can help people to really have a better life where we go find, starting with the legal status, policy that incorporate them better in the system. You know, people in the states that never even come to the capital, people from the community, from the campesino sector that even know to read, and they cross the border, and the life are safe, but start over, it's very, very hard. And I think we have to find out a way to all this process not be so hard and find to be more humanitarian.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Maradiaga.
Yes, I fully agree with an nexus assessment, and being in exile and stateless in the U.S., I know how difficult it is. So I would like to highlight a couple of issues. One is the issue of statelessness, and this is affecting the population in exile in general, even those that are not formally denationalized because of the denial of passports. So I will urge respectfully the U.S. Commission to address this issue with Homeland Security. It's very difficult to have the possibility of having it for example, a travel document. So many of us as activists, as human rights defenders, have been forced to postpone our testimonies in international institutions. For example, I was supposed to testify in Geneva. I could not travel due to the lack of travel documents. So anything the U.S. Commission can do for the general Nicaraguan community in exile, but particularly for the activist community, will be very relevant. The second point, it's the attacks on private property. I know that this is an issue that has not been properly addressed. I will use two examples, which is the example of Corner of Love, an organization founded in Nicaragua by U.S. missionaries from Seattle. Their asset has been, expropriated, and the same thing happened with Fabretto Children Foundation, which is an organization created mostly with resources by the community, the Catholic community of Chicago. What I'm trying to say with this is that a country like Nicaragua is having a free trade agreement, but with the U.S., but at the same time is tackling the philanthropic investments of a number of religious missions, both Catholics and Protestant in Nicaragua. So I think it's a time to address the issue of the free trade agreement, because it's unacceptable that in this pro quo, the state of Nicaragua is not fulfilling its commitments, not only on the issue of religious freedom and broadly on human rights, but attacking the investments, as we heard, for example, by Pastor Hancock, there are significant investments to serve the Nicaraguan population. It's very hard for us to understand why this question of the free trade agreement is not being addressed as urgently as we think it should. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Maradiaga. I see that Commissioner Ferguson has a question, but I'd like to pose one quick one before I give her chance. And this is to Ms. Alfred. Ms. Alfred, the indigenous communities in Nicaragua have been marginalized, honestly, since colonial days, certainly marginalized and repressed under the Somoza regime. So I'm curious, why do you think that the Ortega Murillo regime is focusing on the indigenous communities' religious freedom issues right now? Why are the indigenous communities a target?
Thank you for the question. The regime come broken like all their stone of resistance in Nicaragua, and I believe the indigenous people was the last one, and that's how we can see even all this attack indigenous people is not from now. It's not since now 2018. It's since we can see in the 80s the massacre of the La Navidad Roja and all the policy that behind a recognition of a collective right, which is in the practice is not right. There's a lot of law that recognize collective rights, but in the practice you can see that that is not right. So it was like a simulation that we are doing, but we are not doing. And this come increasing, and in the last 20 years we can see, and after the case of the Awastingli versus Nicaragua in behalf of the Inter-American Commission and the Inter-American Court that established that Nicaragua required to guarantee the right of land and natural resource. And after pressure with the World Bank, Nicaragua accept to start to implement and demarcate and title indigenous land. But at the end, even the government wasn't open to recognize, because it's the same, no? It's this policy of discrimination that comes from the colonial, and we can see even now our struggles in a national context. We are the lost in everything. Like when we focus, and there I want to make a parenthesis and thank you for bringing up the situation of the indigenous community, because we always talk about Nicaragua and we are never there. And we are the 12% of the Nicaragua population, but also we are the 31% of the territory, and we're never there. But we're there like for the natural resource, for resources now, but not like people, as people who don't have rights. So what I think is at the end, remember in the 80s, there was a strong resistance of the indigenous people in the 80s. And that's something that it reminds in the memory of the dictators. And that's why they went like step by step. And I believe that it's hard to me to recognize that they broke in the last stone of resistance of indigenous people today, which is, with the banishment of the leader, Misquito Brooklyn Rivera, who is a person that worked for many years for the right of Indigenous people and for the religion and for the Moravian Church. And today, and I agree with what our other testimonies say, that silence cannot be considered like if nothing is happening. Today, back in Nicaragua, in our communities, Moravian Church is being targeted, and everything is in silent. But that doesn't mean that is not happening. And even like we were asking what take place with the leader Indigenous, but also with other leaders, but. There's the policy of fear, the policy of terrorism that the government is implementing reach to the community, and we know that is not the moment like to come up. So just say that yes, it's a policy of terror, what you say, of afraid that's in the community, but that doesn't mean that we are not in resistance. We keep in resistant as Indigenous people. And we keep on surviving, and we keep on demanding the respect of human rights and collective rights.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Ferguson.
I know we don't have too much time left, but I have two brief questions. One, Pastor Hancock, I'm wondering if you have any update on the conditions of the 11 pastors from Mountain Gateway Ministry that have been imprisoned, if you have any brief update there. And then for Mr. Maradiaga, I'm wondering if you can share with us what these prisoners of conscience experience in prison. And then if we have time, I have a dear friend from Nicaragua. She's been living in the US for about 20 years, but she goes back with some frequency. She goes back home, and she has talked a lot about the prohibition of the religious processions and how important they are in her culture and how important they are in sort of the enculturation of the children and passing the faith on to their children. I'm wondering if you could give us a sense of those, the public processions on feast days or Holy Week or Christmas, because she keeps saying to me, I'm so sad about that. So two quick questions. Maybe we'll start with you, Pastor Hancock.
And let me add, please, Mayor, we're nearly to.
Sure. No, we don't have any update. There's been zero contact and no way to verify. The OAS issued precautionary measures trying to find out the same thing. And of course, they ignored all of that. So we don't have any official word at all. We don't really know. We haven't heard from them since they were arrested in December.
So Mr. Maradiaga, you have knowledge of the conditions, of the likely conditions. Can you share with us what they might be experiencing?
Thank you for your question. They're very extreme, and for people of faith, they're particularly challenging. For example, forced nudity, which is a humiliating act, particularly for the Catholic priests and also for women. The complete isolation, the lack of a Bible was something that for me as a man of faith was particularly hurtful. We were not, in the case of the prisoners that were at the maximum security prison known as El Chipote, were not allowed to pray for the first year out loud. In the second year, due to significant international pressure, at least we're allowed to do some prayers. So my point is that religious persecution continues inside the prison, permanent interrogation, and lack of contact with the rest of the world. In terms of the religious festivities, this is another attack, direct attack on religious freedom, and it's also humiliating in the sense that it's a direct example of the religious manipulation that I spoke on my testimony. So it's not only that these acts are being blocked, but the Sandinista party is trying to create a sort of shadow festivities that are not officially sanctioned by the church. And it's deeply humiliating for us Catholic to see that some of these festivities have been politically manipulated by the Sandinista regime.
Yes, she told me that the religious sort of feast day patron saint procession has been replaced with a carnival, like they do totally secular, it's been replaced. So thank you so much for that answer.
We have time for one more question if another commissioner would like to pose a question. If not, open the floor for any final statements from any of the witnesses today.
I'll start briefly just to thank you so much for this opportunity. I wanted to reemphasize the fact that even though the Catholic Church is a particular target, as we have seen in this testimony, is a generalized persecution to other denominations such as the Moravian Church and also the Evangelical community. I also like to highlight, due to the brief amount of time, I could not address the recently issued report by the UN Expert Group on Nicaragua that has just issued a magnificent report that I will urge that report to be a reference for further action. So once again, commissioners, thank you so much for doing this. We Nicaraguans require your solidarity, and we are very much grateful for this opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Maradiaga. Any other last words?
If I may,
Well, please.
just really maybe to, in very brief terms, summarize again some of the recommendations that I think need to be seriously considered. I've mentioned them, others have mentioned them as well, in terms of not only helping to ameliorate the situation of religious freedom in the country, but more broadly, helping to dismantle the authoritarian regime itself. And, this includes, as others have said, targeting the instruments and the agents of repression that Ortega uses to oppress his people, dismantling the networks from foreign governments that provide support, including the PRC and Russia, that support material and other kinds of support to the regime, financial support, working with those remaining multilateral development banks that are still lending to Nicaragua, including lending money that then finds its way to Nicaragua's security forces, uplifting the voices of people in exile, including some of our witnesses here, providing support for them, providing support for diaspora communities, working with diaspora communities to document the human rights abuses that can maybe someday find justice in Nicaraguan courts when there's a return to democracy, but may also be able to find justice in international courts using the principle of universal jurisdiction. Considering, having the U.S. government push for a special rapporteurship on religious freedom within the OAS. And then, as Felix has said more than once, and I said as well, considering further economic measures, perhaps even as much as suspending in some way, shape, or form Nicaragua from DR-CAFTA, or CAFTA-DR, I should say, although it's not clear whether there's a legal mechanism for that. But at a minimum, finding other pressure points on Nicaragua's economy, particularly those sectors that the Ortega Murillo family is benefiting from, are actions that I think are necessary to improve the overall situation of human rights in the country, with, of course, an effect on religious freedom.
Thank you. This has just been a tremendously informative and moving hearing. I want to thank all of today's witnesses, Mr. Hernandez-Roy, Mr. Maradiaga, Mr. Hancock, Ms. Alfred. Thank you very, very much for your testimony. It will be something that USCIRF takes very seriously going forward. With that, let me say then that we have run out of time, and this hearing is officially adjourned. Thank you all.